What's going on?
We heard a bang. We heard a bang. And she told me to get out. And then I heard screaming. So I came back and she was on the ground.
She said no, she didn't need any assistance. She would, she knew what she needed to do, and she would do it, and she understood. There was a very large, or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream.
Although this may sound pretty strange to the ears of people who don't have a violent bone in their bodies, there are plenty of reasons why people choose to hurt or unalive other people. It ranges from jealousy, obsession, and revenge to plain cruelty. But in this story, you're about to find out one of the most bizarre reasons why a daughter, Sydney Powell, unalived her own mother, Brenda Powell. What events led Sydney Powell to attack her mother in such a horrific and chilling manner? And how was she finally caught? Let's find out in the story of the teen who murdered her mom after an argument.
No, please!
Man!
She's in the court now! No!
Stop! Hold on, we gotta figure out what's going on!
In March of 2020, law enforcement officers were sent to the Powell home in the 1900 block of Scudder Drive for a welfare check. When they got to the house, they found Sydney Powell hysterical. She was so hysterical that it was very hard at first to understand what she was saying.
Take her outside.
Come on. Come on.
Is she gonna be okay?
Come on.
I
Come on. You just need to cooperate with me, all right?
She eventually had to be taken outside by one officer while the others examined the scene. While outside, Sydney explained to the officer that someone had broken into their home through the window and hurt her mother, who is now laying in a pool of red bodily fluid.
What's going on? What's going on?
We heard a bang. We heard a bang. And she told me to get out. And then I heard screaming. So I came back and she was on the ground.
Sydney weaved a web of lies for months until the officers found out there had been no intruder, and Sydney had been the one who hurt her mother herself. During the court proceedings, a psychiatrist diagnosed Sydney with psychosis, but another psychiatrist disagreed with the diagnosis. He said it was impossible for someone suffering from psychosis to stage a crime scene, lie about it to the officers, and continue to lie about it for months. But what truly happened on that day? Did Sydney just snap as her defense team claimed? Or was there a different truth? A truth so dark, it would haunt the community of Akron, Ohio for years to come.
Ms. Gaffney, if a student were to have a scholarship, can those type of benefits be put at risk if there's issues with their academics?
Yeah. Yes.
Today's story began in December 2019 when 19-year-old student Sydney Powell, a student of Mount Union University, found out she had been suspended from the school. Sydney had been warned multiple times before that she was failing out of school and that she needed to pick up her grades if she wanted to remain at the school. In fact, according to the Associate Dean of Student Affairs at Mount Union University, Michelle Gaffney, a student, is given many warnings and goes through a process of academic warnings and academic probation before being put on academic suspension.
There's a committee that looks at it, that reviews all students at the end of every semester who are below a certain grade point average. And at that time, they may choose to put a student on academic warning, academic probation, academic suspension.
Sydney Powell went through all of those steps, but failed to get her grades up, which led to the university putting her on suspension. Here's where Sydney's problems began. You see, Sydney came from a high-achieving, successful family where failure was not an option. Her mother, Brenda Powell, was a child life specialist at Akron Children's Hospital Family Center for Childhood Cancer and Blood Disorders. Her father, Stephen Powell, owned his own steel treating company in Akron, Ohio. But Sydney was failing college.
Okay, what is that document?
This would be the letter indicating that Sydney was suspended.
Okay, so that's a suspension letter. That's the letter that's sent to students?
Yes.
Okay.
Sydney had been sent a letter informing her of her suspension, just like most students in her shoes, except unlike most students, Sydney refused to be suspended. She did not try to appeal the letter, which would be the next step for students who are suspended. She instead resumed the next semester in January 2020 as if the suspension never happened. She had been attending classes and her sorority meetings like a regular student. Though Sydney was able to keep up the ruse for a while, it wasn't long before the jig was up. The president of her sorority, who usually compiled a list of students attending sorority meetings for the sake of collecting dues, figured out that Sydney was not enrolled for the semester but was attending meetings, living in the dorms, and going to class.
One of our staff members, who's the director of student involvement, had one of her student leaders, that was a sorority president, come to her and indicate that there was a student coming to sorority meetings who wasn't on our list of enrolled students for the semester.
Sydney was then called to the dean's officer, where Michelle Gaffney, the associate dean, had a conversation with her. Sydney tried to deny being suspended at first, even going so far as to lie that though she had issues with her academics in the previous semester, she managed to fix them during the break. She eventually had no choice but to admit to the truth when confronted with evidence.
I said, Sydney, you received a suspension letter that you signed for. And so we spoke a little bit further, and she said, well, yes, she had, but she had been hoping to get things changed or fixed.
Though Sydney told Michelle that she was trying to get her suspension changed or fixed, which meant that she was trying to file an appeal, there was no record of an appeal filed on behalf of Sydney Powell at the university.
I had double-checked before I called to see because I thought maybe she had appealed and I hadn't been notified that an appeal had gone through. So I checked and there was no schedule for Sydney.
Which meant that was just another lie she told to get out of the trouble she was in. The lies would soon start stacking up against her. Sydney was told that she would need to leave campus because she was no longer a student at the university. It seemed to hit Sydney like a ton of bricks, almost as if she had not considered the consequences of failing. Michelle, sensing that Sydney was finding it difficult to face her suspension, offered to help tell her parents the truth, but Sydney responded with something so chilling.
And she said no, she didn't need any assistance. She would, she knew what she needed to do, and she would do it, and she understood.
While Michelle Gaffney thought Sydney had understood she was no longer allowed on campus and would be moving back home, Sydney had other plans. Sydney asked for a bit of time to move her things, but a few weeks later, Michelle was again notified that Sydney was still living on campus.
We became aware that Sydney was still spending quite a bit of time in the hall, enough that it seemed as though she was still living there.
Michelle Gaffney again invited Sydney to her office for a conversation, only this time involving the Dean of Student Affairs. Sydney at first did not show up for the conversation until a staff member was sent to the dorm to bring her to the officer. So in February 2020, Sydney Powell met with Michelle Gaffney for a second time, along with the Dean of Student Affairs, where it was again stressed to her that she could not continue to live on campus if she was not enrolled.
We met with her together to indicate that we needed to talk about the fact that she was still living on campus despite not being enrolled, and that we couldn't continue to have her living on campus.
Sydney again said that she understood that she was not allowed on campus, but that she needed additional time to move out. Michelle again offered to call Sydney's parents and let them know the situation so they could come help her move out, but Sydney quickly responded that she had told them, but they were on vacation and not around, so they couldn't help move her out.
That they were on vacation, in fact, they weren't home, and that they were having a lot of problems with her little brother, and she didn't want to bother them because of all the issues they were having with her little brother.
Michelle and the dean then went ahead to set a deadline for Sydney to move out of campus, a deadline Sydney agreed to, but that's not exactly how it went down.
Can you recall what happened after she was told to move out at that second meeting? What happened next?
She didn't move out.
She did not move out?
Right.
Okay.
At this point, it became very clear that Sydney had something else up her sleeve and wasn't going to move out voluntarily. They were again forced to deploy security to bring her to the officer, where they stressed she could not be living on campus. Sensing that Sydney absolutely did not want her parents to find out that she had flunked out of school, they employed different tactics. They threatened Sydney, telling her that if she did not move out, they would call her parents. Sydney told them very strongly that they could not call her parents.
And she refused She absolutely did not want us to do that.
Once Sydney was threatened with a phone call to her parents, she moved out of the campus that very day. On March 3rd, 2020, Sydney's father, Stephen Powell, was working at his steel factory when he received an alert from a tracking app he had installed on Sydney's phone. The alert told him that Sydney was home. That struck him as very odd, as the semester was still ongoing, so Sydney had no business being home. He was instantly worried, so he left work in the middle of the day and drove home to find out why she was home in the middle of the semester.
You get a notification that Sydney's at home, correct?
Yes,
When you see that, you go home.
correct.
All right, and why did you go home?
See why she was home?
Before he left for his house, Stephen Powell left his phone at work because the same app that enables him to track Sydney's movement is also installed on his phone and would have notified Sydney he was on his way home. You see, earlier in the day, Stephen had contacted Mount Union to ask for the tuition bill, but was shocked when he was told his daughter Sydney was not enrolled in Mount Union University. The message was odd, as Sydney had resumed school that semester. He thought it was a fluke at first, but when he saw she was at home, he knew something was up.
Did you have any concern for her at that time?
Just because Mount Union said she wasn't enrolled, but no, I was going to go home and see why she was home so early. And
when Stephen got home, he found Sydney hiding in the basement. He confronted her about the email he had received from Mount Union, but Sydney denied anything was wrong, insisting that she was still enrolled at the university and attending some classes with her friends. Even though there was evidence pointing to the contrary, Stephen believed her.
What did she say?
she was, I don't remember the details, but I remember she said she was still going to some of her classes with her friend Lauren.
What was, when she told you this, what was your response?
That we would work it out.
Stephen assured his daughter that everything would be fine. All she needed to do was get through that semester, and if she needed to take a semester off to work things out, then that would be okay. At this point, Sydney got emotional, saying that all of her friends had their lives in order except her. Stephen assured her that was not the case. He then suggested that they call her mother Brenda. According to Stephen, he said that because he felt Brenda was better at handling situations like that than him. He then called Brenda, filled her in on what was going on, and then made one decision he would regret for the rest of his life.
Did you stay at home until Brenda got there, or did you leave before she got home?
I left before she got.
He decided to go back to work before Brenda got home to deal with Sydney. A short while after Stephen left Sydney to wait for Brenda, a member of staff at Mount Union University received a voice note telling them she wanted to speak with the Dean of Student Affairs in regards to Sydney Powell. The voice note was from Brenda Powell.
They had spoken to our administrative assistant
Okay.
and asked for someone to call them about their daughter,
Who's they?
Brenda Powell.
Brenda Powell. Okay.
He dialed, the phone was answered, and Mrs. Powell answered.
You say Mrs. Powell. Is that Brenda who answered?
Brenda answered.
But just after introducing themselves, something went horribly wrong.
Dean Fraser was speaking and simply said, Brenda, this is Dean Fraser. I'm sitting here with Michelle Gaffney, our Associate Dean of Students. We're returning your call, and that's about as far as we got.
According to Michelle, Brenda responded to the introduction. That was the last they ever heard from her.
There was a very large or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream.
The next sound they heard coming through the phone was a piercing scream.
The other sound that I heard at that same time, or right after, was sort of an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody. I'd always heard that expression of the air being knocked, having the wind knocked out of you, but I didn't. That's actually what it sounded like. And then several more repeated thuds. I don't know how to describe the sound.
At that point, Michelle and the dean are frantic, repeatedly asking what is going on, but there were no responses from the other end of the phone, just screams.
Very definitely felt like someone was being attacked. And so we weren't getting an answer. I think at some point I said, if you can't respond. We're going to call the police.
Michelle then ran outside the dean's office and asked his administrative assistant to find Michelle's address so she could call law enforcement officers to the home. While the assistant was getting Sydney's house address, the dean was still on the phone with Brenda's phone when all of a sudden the call cut off and he was met with silence on the other end. They kept calling the phone back, but it kept going to voicemail. But a few minutes later, something that can only be described as bizarre occurred.
Because the phone was answered
Okay.
on the third try to the number, and Dean Fraser said something along the lines, "Brenda, is that you? Are you there?" And the voice on the other end said, "Yes, this is Brenda."
That voice didn't sound at all like Brenda Powell. In fact, Michelle recognized that voice. She had heard it a few times that semester.
I was sure it was Sydney. Both Dean Fraser and I looked at each other and sort of shook our heads at each other and said, "That's not Brenda."
What happened next was even more bizarre.
He then said, I don't, Sydney, I think this is you. This is not Brenda."
The dean and Michelle were met with silence, and then the call cut off again. They then called the Akron PD to inform them that they believed Sydney had attacked her mom, and they needed a welfare check on Brenda Powell to make sure she was all right. But when they got there, it was a whole different scene than the one Michelle and the dean had heard on the phone.
Wait, she's on the ground. So there's...
Who is it?
My mom! There's someone broke in the back window.
All right, hold on.
And she's on the ground. And there's
Hold on. Where's your mom?
There's someone there!
Okay, stay right here.
No, there's so much blood. No, please!
Sydney met the officers at the door. She was very frantic and couldn't stand still. She then went on to spill her web of lies, telling the officers someone had broken in and attacked through the window. Her mom, sensing the danger, told her to run away. According to Sydney, she heard a scream, and when she came back, she saw her mom on the floor, badly injured. There were a few curious things about what Sydney told the officers on March 3rd. One, although she said she was there when someone broke in through the window, she never attempted to call 911. Another thing that was quite strange was that Sydney told officers someone had broken in, but the window looked like it had been broken from the inside, not the outside, which would be the case had someone broken in. It was clear her story was not adding up, but Sydney would go on to maintain her innocence, claiming multiple times someone else, not her, attacked her mother. Meanwhile, Michelle and the dean found out a couple of days later that Brenda Powell was unalived in her home, around the same time that they heard what sounded like an attack on the phone. A few days after that, Michelle got a visit from the investigator on the case. They did not hold back, telling the investigator everything they knew.
You had an opportunity to meet or have a conversation with a detective with the Akron Police Department?
A couple days later.
Okay, and you shared the same information with him?
Yes.
On the day Brenda Powell was attacked, the officer speaking to her noticed cuts and bruises all over her hand, but he was about to ask her about it, and she suddenly collapsed and folded herself into the fetal position.
Sydney. 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 What's going on?
Though she hadn't lost any consciousness, she stopped responding to anyone. She also began to tap her head on the pavement in a very strange way. This led the officers to ask if Sydney had any mental illness. She had reacted so bizarrely to the officers that they wanted to make sure she wasn't suffering from any illnesses that could have caused that.
Sir, we don't... Does she need mental...
No, she was having a little trouble at school at Mount Union, and she came back home to try and work things out just today.
Brenda and Sydney were both transported to the hospital where Brenda was pronounced dead and Sydney was treated for her cuts. That same night, things got even worse for Stephen Powell, as Sydney was arrested and charged with the murder of her mother. In February of 2022, Sydney Powell entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Her meticulous attempt at concealing her crime by lying to everyone made it hard for the court to believe her. On September 28, 2022, 2 years after her brutal attack on her mother, Sydney Powell was convicted for the charge, and she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Thanks for watching, you guys. What are your thoughts on this case? Let me know in a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.